to be able to win back the red wall.
Wed wall.
Oh, my brain is fluffy today. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with, well, it was your party, the Green Party, a new left party, or whatever party we end up being a part of. I'm your host, Shanice McBean, and today I am joined by Jonas.
Hello.
And Joe.
Hey Shanice, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And I'm good because we have sold 50% of our tickets to our live show, which will be on the 3rd of July, Friday the 3rd of July. And it will be at Pelican House in London. Doors will be opening at 6. And guys, we are ready to announce our first of 3 speakers, guests, amazing people who will be joining us to discuss everything to do with parties and politics. And our first guest is Joshua Virasamy.
Hey.
Joshua Virasamy is a wicked, amazing activist. He has roots in the Black Lives Matter movement. From 2014, we were organising together around BLM, and he is currently an organiser within the London Renters Union, so doing incredible work there. And he was also, importantly, part of the early days of the founding of your party. So he's going to be joining us at the live show to give us some deep political analysis and insights into, where we should take politics today. But without further ado, it's been a big week politically with Andy Burnham winning in Makerfield. So Jonas, can you give us a breakdown of Just Wagwan?
Yeah. So Andy Burnham, who effectively ran on a ticket in Makerfield by-election of changing the Labour Party and giving the North a voice in Westminster politics without yet committing to sparking a Labour leadership contest, decisively won the Makerfield by-election, duppied Reform by 9,000 odd votes. He also managed to get more votes than the entire right. So that's Reform, that's Restore, that's the Tories who didn't get their deposit back, defeated all of those guys combined. His campaign was a interesting exercise, shall we say. It drew on an incredible degree of, I think you could say, affect, a kind of nod into histories of the North, relied somewhat upon his own affability and the kind of cultures of the region. You know, the kind of there's a lot of people sharing the image of the leaflet which was going through the doors, which was a leaflet in the shape of a 5-inch vinyl. So it's kind of nods to Northern music, record culture. And I think it's a kind of singular example of a kind of normie populism, the whole campaign, you know. It involved a lot of triangulation on immigration, on Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, she is already accepted, on Brexit. But organisationally, you have to say whether this is replicable in some sort of general election is an entirely different question. But you have to say in this instance that organisationally, it was a huge effort. It drew a huge amount of support from Labour canvassers across the country, thousands of people on voting day. I guess one thing that you would say is that it shouldn't really be discarded that this is Burnham country. Do you remember that video from a couple of years ago where there's this kind of there's a journalist who's going around interviewing people in Islington and trying to get them to slag Jeremy Corbyn off, and there's a guy who turns around to them and he goes, "You're not going to get me to slag Jeremy Corbyn off. This is Corbyn country, mate." This is Burnham. This is Burnham country, right? There's a lot of support in parts of the Northwest, particularly because of his role in the Hillsborough Justice campaign, also because of the kind of image of him that he's kind of built as the Greater Manchester mayor. And he ran a campaign which managed to win over voters in an incredibly efficient manner, right? I mean, Persuasion Research have conducted polls which have shown Burnham winning 5% of 2024 Reform voters and 8% of 2024 Conservative voters. I was watching some of the Navarra coverage the other day, and one of the commentators they had on a poster from Ipsos Mori described it as a referendum on Andy Burnham. I was thinking about it, and I wonder if that's the wrong way around. I think this by-election was a referendum on Keir Starmer,
100%.
Forced open by Andy Burnham and his desire to take the reins of the both the Labour Party and also the British state. And so in lots of ways, it was a referendum on Starmer, but it was a referendum on Burnham's terms, not on, say, Nigel Farage's terms. And we talked a lot last week. We had this kind of conversation, didn't we, about whether Nigel Farage's inflammatory remarks in the wake of the footage of Henry Novak's arrest being leaked. And we said that there's a tension for reform here in trying to fend off Rupert Lowe and Restore on their right. They have been radicalizing their rhetoric. It seems really clear that even if Burnham got more votes than the right combined, that the dilemma for Farage trying to build between a majoritarian politics or trying to keep his base peeling off to Restore, and so up in the inflammatory racism, has had a negative effect in this context after the kind of racist pogroms in Southampton and Belfast, which isn't necessarily to say that that's born from a kind of deep-seated anti-racist instinct in the country. Maybe we can discuss this more, but it is to say that people don't like riots and they don't like pogroms and they don't like them against the neighbours. So I think that's had an impact. I think one thing we have to bear in mind here is just how poorly organised the right are in some ways, particularly Reform in this instance, actually, I would say. The ground game that Reform organised left a lot to be desired. The candidate was easily humiliated in basically every public appearance that they made. The Restore ground game, on the other hand, was a little bit more impressive in some ways, proportionally speaking to the Reform ground game, but it was a bit undermined by the fact that they effectively hid their candidate. Kind of interesting anecdote in The Spectator, of all places, a place that should be relatively friendly to Restore, where they arranged an interview with the Restore candidate, which was then pulled because she was apparently busy. So when they tried to rearrange it, Restore said, no, we can't do it this time because she needs more press training. And so they offered up Rupert Lowe instead. I mean, the question here for me with these kind of political outfits, that kind of, for all the financial backing they have, for all of their performance in the polls, organizationally, they're incredibly weak. And that really shows in these kind of by-elections in Makerfield, just as in Gorton and Denton, that take on a national focus. And I wonder, for me, if there's a question about hyperpolitics here when we think about these kind of outfits, which is that they can come onto the scene incredibly quickly. They can do incredibly well in the polls. They can have a really significant impact on political discourse and conversation. But when it comes to trying to be able to transform all of that into cadre and meaningful operations, they kind of hit a bit of a limit, and we're seeing this successively. Now, I think there's a question about whether that matters in the context of a general election compared to a by-election, when like the focus isn't completely upon one place with all of the national implications that it has. But there is a question of like, these outfits are making candidates, and the candidates aren't well trained. They're not necessarily cadre yet, and that has a significant impact on their ability to do well politically. I think there's also a question for me here of, to what extent is this replicable outside of Makerfield? And this is a big question that, on the one hand, everyone is like, 2029, a Reform government is going to be terrible, and we have to do everything to stop it, and that includes now kind of getting behind Burnham to stop Reform. But on the other hand, I think there's a kind of boosterism, which maybe we could talk about in the hot take, about how significantly Burnham dismantled Reform. And I just think it's worth saying that like Makerfield is a historic Labour constituency. It's disproportionately white, older, high levels of car ownership, low levels of unemployment, average levels of economic inactivity. Voted overwhelmingly for Brexit in 2016, yes, but without breaking for Boris Johnson's Tories in the 2019 collapse of the so-called Red Wall. So it's not a typical seat in some ways, but it does pose a bunch of questions. And I would say one of the significant attack lines on Andy Burnham in this contest was that he's just using Makerfield as a stepping stone to go into Parliament and to become Labour leader and then Prime Minister. And obviously that's true in lots of ways. The difficulty for the right and for Burnham's opponents in this situation is everybody knew it was true. And everybody wanted Keir Starmer gone. And that had a significant impact on Burnham's success here, right? And I think we should bear that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't think we should I really don't think we should extrapolate from this by-election too much, because it was such a particular by-election. It's not just a by-election as opposed to a general election, which obviously has the specific dynamics of massive media focus on it, loads of activists there because they're not spread all across the country, the fact that it's midterm through a government, the fact that people know that they're not actually voting to change the government, although in this case they kind of were. But it was also this weird by-election in the sense that you were replacing the Labour leader and thus the Prime Minister via the means of a by-election, which is just really weird in British electoral history. And so for that reason, it's hard to like massively extrapolate from it. That said, it was absolutely remarkable, I thought, how the votes that would usually go to the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Labour as potentially a bloc, if that's how you want to think about it, and we'll talk about that a bit later, sorted themselves so unanimously into Andy Burnham's column, whereas on the right that just didn't happen at all, and you had this really quite resilient Restore vote, 6% in the end, 7%, something like that.
7%,
7% in the end, that just didn't go Reform. I was chatting to my mate Ollie Haynes, who's a far right watcher and writes a lot on them and researches on them a lot. He was just making the point, which I think is really strong, that Restore are not just another party on the right. They were a party that was set up in direct antagonism to Reform. Like Lowe was Reform and was kicked out and set up Restore as a rival outfit to Farage. There is absolutely no love lost between the two men and the two leaderships. It really seems quite irreconcilable. Not just in the like usual ways of political theatre, but in a kind of like genuine, deeper way. And a lot of Restore supporters also heavily influenced by Tommy Robinson as well. Just see Farage as a sellout, and they see Farage as just part of the establishment and not delivering on a properly white nationalist agenda, essentially. And I think it's not unlike the split between UKIP and the BNP. Actually, it's not unlike that. Although the politics of the whole right have shifted further right, it's not unlike that split.
Well, and that maps in terms of votes, right? And Restore kind of reflects a historic kind of far right vote in the constituency itself.
Yeah, but this just poses an incredible problem for the right wing parties electorally, at least, because it's just making coordination between them incredibly difficult. I mean, you now add in the other factor that Kemi Badenoch is repositioning the Tories as like a centre-right, essentially relatively socially liberal party. Her favourabilities have shot up. She's now one of the most popular politicians in the country, at least on net favourabilities. And also they won a by-election in Aberdeen. On the same night, albeit on local issues. They were campaigning specifically on all, but they won a by-election in Aberdeen. And we're also seeing some Reform councillors in Essex lose by-elections to the Tories. So you're just seeing this very difficult emerging picture for the right, where coordination between them seems incredibly difficult. And I think that is gonna potentially still just like shift a certain section of the country further right, because Restore's influence will radicalize their politics and the people that follow them. But I think electorally it's going to be very difficult for them. I just want to say on the organisational front, I think we should be specific when talking about the organisational capacities of Reform or Restore. I do think that Reform are more than what Paolo Giabada would call a thin platform party. Like they do have branches. They have members who own pubs that have rebranded them as Reform pubs. They do go out and do like community organising, like litter picks and stuff, where you don't realise you're going to a Reform event and then it is a Reform event or it's a community picnic or something like that. It's not just an online phenomenon that mobilises. I think the problem, and again this was a point that Ollie was making to me and I think was really strong, was just that the activist base that they're drawing from are incredibly ill-disciplined and online and in these Facebook groups, whereby there's just basically stuff that you can dig up on any of them relatively easily. Like he pointed me to one guy who I won't name because we don't want to alert them to it, but pointed me to one guy who was very likely for various reasons to be a Reform candidate at the next election. And he was like, look, I just dropped into an open Facebook group and found this guy just openly talking about Enoch Powell a week ago. And he was just like, this is easy. You can do this for anyone within Reform. And I think one of the reasons is because Farage is a lone wolf and he doesn't want to build up a cadre of people that can succeed him, because he I don't think he wants succession in that way. I think another problem is that a lot of the top figures don't want to run in these by-elections because they don't want to lose, and they think they might lose. I thought that dynamic you pointed to, Jonas, was really interesting around Restore not wanting to profile their candidate, probably because the candidate was shit, and wanting Rupert Lowe to do the media interviews, but not wanting Rupert Lowe to lose the by-election and lose the seat and get a losing tally of votes. It's a strange thing where like the hyper leader doesn't want to take the risk electorally, but wants to do all of the press coverage. And that's a very funny dynamic, I think. And yeah, I just think the candidate selection thing just seems to be a real structural problem for Reform. Like I don't believe they've just fucked it up by accident in Gorton and Denton and here. Like it's clearly, they will be throwing money at this. They will be searching through their activist space to find people. They'll be doing betting on people. And I think what they'll be finding is just that their base is all like this. They're just quite ill-disciplined. It's just posted loads of mad shit, and they're a bit like, "Well, okay, what are we going to do? Because we have to run our people at the end of the day. So what are we going to do?" Yeah, and I think that is just like it's a real problem for them. It's a real problem for them.
But is it as much as a problem in the general election though, where you have 600 odd seats, you don't have the kind of national spotlight on the election like you have on Matt Goodwin, like you've had on Robert Kenyon? Like, is it the same problem in that context?
Maybe not, because a national election will be more nationalised and people will be thinking about, who is the next Prime Minister, and they'll be thinking about Nigel Farage leading the party rather than the local candidate. I mean, the other problem that they have there, and I think this is one of the big reasons why quote unquote left bloc voters, and sorry, I keep putting that in air quotes because we're going to come to that later in the episode, but like quote unquote left bloc voters are better organised and are able to vote efficiently for the candidate that can beat Reform, is because Liberal, Democrat, Green and Labour voters are just really scared of Farage and Reform and really scared of a Farage premiership and what might happen. Whereas actually, like, I don't think Reform and Restore voters are that bothered as to whether it's Andy Burnham or whether it's someone else. Obviously, they want to get their guy in, but there isn't the fear factor. There isn't that like negative push factor in the same way, because it would just be more of the same rather than something radically different and scary. And I think that is just like an incredibly strong organising principle.
Yeah, lots to unpick here. I mean, I guess we should say that Andy Burnham's win is the writing on the wall for Keir Starmer. It seems to me that he's got no roots, no way out. But it's also the last gasp for Labour. I know we've said that a couple of times, but I think it's very telling that Andy Burnham's campaign identity made no visual or even political reference to the Labour Party. He made references to Labourism. He made references to the history of the Labour movement, but not the Labour Party itself. And he was very, very clear to distinguish himself from the Labour Party and the current regime within the party. It's almost, you can almost call it like a Labour Party iconoclasm. Like he's completely rejecting the motifs and the statues and the monuments of the Labour Party in favour of this kind of, I guess he was really relying on his kind of personal political identity. But that's a really dangerous game for him, because the more he distances his political identity from the Labour Party, the higher the expectations of his tenure governing will be. And actually, that's a significant tension, because from everything we've seen so far, he's actually not going to be very different to Keir Starmer, other than in the look and feel of him as a politician. But I guess his power play within the Labour Party is now going to be the fact that he can say, hey, look, I held a coalition together that could beat Reform. And I think that's why the writing's on the wall, because he can say he's got the popularity and he's got the political nous to be able to win back the red wall.
Wed wall.
My brain is fluffy today.
Yeah, I mean, listeners should know that, like, we're recording on a Sunday morning here, guys. Have some patience with us.
Yeah.
That wed wall. But yeah, the red wall was wrenched from the Labour Party by the post-Brexit political landscape, and then the subsequent political capitalisation of Reform on that landscape. And Andy Burnham can now say, hey, look, I can win that shit back. But I think the biggest loser, which also tells us a story about what we should be cautious and potentially hesitant of, the biggest loser is Reform, despite the fact that they came in second with 34% of the vote, which isn't terrible. It's a slight increase. I think it's a 2% increase on where they landed in the 2024 election. But the reality is they haven't been able to translate high polling and council elections into by-elections for seats, from Caerphilly to Gorton and Denton. I think there was another one, and now Makerfield. And I watched Nigel Farage's post-election video, and he was absolutely dejected,
Yeah, it was so funny.
To the point, it was hilarious.
Loved it.
But in it, I think, was a warning for us on the left, because he was begging Restore voters to think again. And he directly addressed Restore voters and said, you need to think again about who you're voting for. And obviously the issue in Makerfield was deeper than the Restore vote, because the Reform and Restore vote combined was still 6,000 votes lower than Andy Burnham. So simply mopping up the Restore vote in Makerfield wouldn't have won it for Reform. But Restore can now say, and they can now show, that they can eat into the Reform vote, which is going to be dangerous, not just in Makerfield, but all around the country. And that's exactly why Rupert Lowe, regardless of whatever warnings or whatever fear-mongering people on the right were doing before the election about splitting the right vote, he was always going to run, because now he can say something much more fundamental, and he can do something much more fundamental, which is he can say Reform can't win, and actually we need a different politics that's not Reform, because Reform's selling point, Nigel Farage is actually unpopular on the right. On the street-based right, Tommy Robinson and that lot, deeply unpopular, they hate him. And then a lot of people who vote Reform, who have more radical right-wing politics, see it as a stepping stone to Restore, right? We vote for Reform, we get Restore. That's what they say. But if Nigel Farage can't even win, right? His only selling point was that he's got a sense of right-wing respectability that will allow him to garner votes that can win. If he can't win, then that's a huge problem for him. And I think there's a potential political crisis brewing for Reform if it hasn't started already. There were nascent calls on X, for example, for him to resign. But as Joe's pointed out, they've literally got no talent whatsoever. There is no one waiting in the wings to replace Nigel Farage. And in this space, I think, of crisis for Nigel Farage and Reform, Restore could emerge as a much more powerful force, because they will be able to say, hey, look, Reform can't win. They're not going to be a stepping stone for a more radical politics on the right. So we need that radical politics now. And you can see Rupert Lowe is already using Makerfield to attempt to pull Nigel Farage and Reform closer to the idea of mass deportations, remigration, towards a more ethnic as opposed to civic nationalism. And I think the collapse of Reform, although obviously it's something that we want and in many ways would be a good thing, I don't think we could be complacent on what that means, because Restore is there waiting in the wings for that collapse.
I think I'm starting to understand the story of Restore and Reform, specifically Restore as a story of like online radicalization and kind of hitting the barrier of like majoritarian electoralism. And I guess what I mean by that is that, you have this disaggregated right who are radicalized online into great replacement theory and all of this. And, like they start to believe it in like a deep kind of like civilizational sense, where it's us versus the Muslims and all the black and brown people. And we're going to be these literally like white knights, coming in to save the West. And but they become so intensely radicalized because they're not actually having much, interaction with society and people in the real world, and they're spending a lot of time online because the right set it up like that. Musk has bought Twitter. They have all of these ways of radicalizing people in that way, that then they come and try and do electoralism, and what they're going to end up doing, I think, is pulling the majority vehicle that they had, which was Reform, that did seem capable of building a 31, 32, 33% voter base that could have delivered a majority at an election, essentially too far to the right, and meaning that it's just going to be too far out of whack with the general attitudes of most people, which I think Jonas referred to earlier, which is not necessarily avowedly anti-racist, but it's definitely not interested in having like pogroms and disorder on the street and, It's not interested in the realities of deporting millions of people. And I just think that is not necessarily a good time for our politics at all, because you may end up with a far more militant and coherent and ideological and fascist far right. But it may well make a big difference to who wins the next election and whether Farage can become prime minister. I think just riffing off something else that Shanice said, like, I definitely think one of the risks that Andy Burnham is taking by focusing on himself rather than the Labour Party is that he's going to succumb to the fragilities of populism, where you load everything into the hyper leader. And it's great whilst they're doing great, but then when they start to do badly, or if scandal comes out, or if the shine comes off, then suddenly the whole project falls apart, because the project was not based on a coherent ideology. It wasn't based on a party identity or a collective identity. It was based on this individual identity. I have friends on the Labour left and on the Labour soft left, and have been talking to them over the last week, and their take is that they're feeling quite bullish after this. As you might imagine, they're feeling quite bullish. They seem relatively confident that Ed Miliband's going to end up as the Chancellor. And their orientation is that I think they want to do a year of tax and spend retail politics that, makes things a bit better and make sure that people can feel stuff like lowering bus fares across the country and stuff like that kind of retail politics. And then go to the country for a mandate and call a general election, maybe in 18 months, to get a mandate for the bigger stuff that he wants to do, proportional representation and constitutional reform. And they feel quite bullish about it. Maybe they're being naive, but they feel quite bullish about that timeline and his ability to do that. Although it has to be said, a lot rests on whether Miliband gets picked as Chancellor. I think if any of the others who are mooted, like Shabana Mahmood or Yvette Cooper or Wes Streeton, end up as Chancellor, then the whole thing's just completely fucked. And yeah, it's going to fall apart for sure.
All right, well, I guess part of this conversation is the reality that there's much more to come. So we will certainly continue chatting about Andy Burnham in future episodes. But
every episode on Andy Burnham. Every
Please
single
no.
one. No.
It was really funny to me when you just turned around and you said, "I've got friends on the Labour left." It felt like a confessional almost.
I know.
Maybe we need to get Andy Burnham in our logo now alongside Zach.
Oh, the logo's fucked, man. What are we going to do about the logo? The concept for the logo is just done. It doesn't work anymore.
Andy Burnham on the logo. I'm sorry.
As this conversation throws up, and as Joe just alluded to, there are a lot of open questions with regards to the next 3 years before the general elections. Joe, can you prise open some of those questions for us?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about one specific question, which is the dreaded Progressive Alliance, which is obviously going to come to the fore and lots of people are going to talk about. And yeah, I'm going to give a bit of background on Progressive Alliances, and I'm going to make an argument that initially sounds like a riddle, but it will be clear by the end of the hot take, which is that we might now be in conditions which are potentially the most suitable for a progressive alliance, maybe since the early 20th century. But that is also precisely the reason why we might not actually need it. So the conditions might be there, but that's why a progressive alliance might not actually be necessary. And I will explain that argument in due course. So yeah, like a progressive alliance, it's a term that dates back to the early 20th century. It was originally used to describe the Gladstone-McDonnell Pact, which was an agreement between the Liberal Party and the Labour Representation Committee, which was a forerunner to the Labour Party, who stood aside for each other in various constituencies to ensure that they won more seats. The modern usage is resurrected around 2015 by Neil Lawson, and Compass, which is a cross-party organisation, was originally affiliated to the Labour Party, but now cross-party. With a similar concept, the idea that parties will stand aside, parties of similar politics who have a fear of either the Tories or a former right-wing party getting, and will stand aside candidates in constituencies where only one of them can clearly win. So if there's a constituency where the Liberal Democrats are polling incredibly well, but the Greens and Labour are nowhere, the Greens and Labour stand candidates aside. So then all of the votes from the progressive bloc, again, air quotes, go towards the Liberal Democrats. This is precisely what happened in the Richmond Park by-election in 2016. The Greens stood down for the Lib Dems because it's between the Lib Dems and the Tories. It also, I think, most formally happened in 2019 when there was a Unite to Remain pact. So this was kind of like framed around Brexit and Remain between the Lib Dems, Greens and Plaid across 60 different seats, where in each of those Lib Dems, Greens and Plaid stood down when they didn't really have a chance of winning, so their Remain votes could go to the other parties. You'll notice Labour never engaged in that. Corbynism and Labour under Corbyn were never really interested in a progressive alliance. It's also the case that there aren't just progressive alliances that have happened in UK politics. There have also been regressive alliances. And the most notable one was in 2019 when Farage stood down a whole swathe of candidates for Boris Johnson after getting Boris Johnson to agree to a hard Brexit and run on or at least a harder Brexit programme. The unspoken part of that was that it wasn't just that Johnson was running on a harder Brexit programme, but it was also the fact that he was running against Corbyn, who the right were terrified of getting into power. So, the threat of and the fear of Corbyn was a disciplining effect on the right, and it pushed them towards this regressive alliance. More on that in a bit. I think we need to be clear that, a progressive alliance is very different to, say, a popular front. So, a popular front is an old communist term calling for a kind of like a broad anti-fascist alliance between different parties that represent different classes, and they come with a shared policy program and they come with a shared program for government. I think the New Popular Front in France that happened a couple of years ago is a decent example of this, where, in opposition to Le Pen and the Front National, various centre-left and left parties actually ran on a shared program, pretty much defined by the France Insoumise, the party run by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. The Progressive Alliance is not that. There's no shared program, and it's not really understood theoretically as a kind of like a cross-class alliance. It's more a way of coordinating to, you could say, like, root round a broken electoral system. It's kind of like a technocratic electoral fix, as it were, where you start from the premise of first past the post is fucked. It awards parties of the right, at least traditionally still, but definitely traditionally, too many seats based on the amount of vote that they have. There's this latent progressive majority in the country, and what we need to make sure we coordinate candidates in different places to ensure that the voting system doesn't ruin us. As we've kind of implied, there are different ways this can happen. The most formal way is cooperation between parties, where they literally step down candidates. And we've gone through a few of those examples. There's also a softer version, I would say, of progressive alliances, where you don't necessarily stand down a candidate, but you'd slow down a campaign and you wouldn't allocate resources to it. And that is precisely what we saw at Makerfield. The Greens didn't really run a campaign, and basically afterwards the Greens admitted that they didn't run a campaign. And we also selected a candidate, and then that candidate got struck off and we selected another candidate, and it was reflected in our vote. It's worth saying that there are de facto progressive alliances from below as well. It's not just necessarily about coordination between party elites. The progressive alliances from below, I think, can come from local branches coordinating between each other and deciding not to run candidates, so not coming from the elite level in the party. It can come from tactical voting websites being pushed very hard, third-party tactical voting websites to, inform voters as to where they can vote progressively or not. And also, I think the most organic expression of it, if this can count within the phrase of a progressive alliance, is just when voters basically decide to do it for themselves, and voters decide to vote tactically rather than voting based on like a deeply held party affiliation. And I think like a lot of the conditions that are needed for like some form of either organic or formal progressive alliance do essentially exist now. There's this theory pushed by a psephologist called Ben Ansell, which I'm relatively convinced of, not in a totalizing way, but relatively convinced of, that the UK population is polarizing into these kind of like left and right blocks, and you actually have like people who, based on social attitudes surveys, are really quite similar on kind of like cultural issues and economic issues, voting for the Liberal Democrats, Labour and the Greens. The Green vote is more radical in terms of economic and social issues, but in terms of the broader British public, it's relatively in the same quadrant. And then you have the Tories and Reform and Restore with a relatively similar set of voters who, at least on social issues, are kind of basically in the same place. Economic issues, they're a lot more spread, and that's why when we campaign on economic issues, it splits the right bloc. But on the social issues, they're kind of like all up here in the top right quadrant. And this wasn't always the case. I think this notion of like left and right bloc politics is very good for advocates of the Progressive Alliance, because it basically argues that what you need to do is you need to dominate your block of voters rather than trying to chase some kind of like mythical voters from the other side who are never going to come back to you. So, like avowed Reform voters or whatever. It could be argued that this was the massive mistake that Starmer made in his kind of deep political strategy, is that he always had this idea of the hero voter as the, socially conservative Reform voter, and basically punched in the face everyone who might think about voting Green or Lib Dem. People then did go vote Green and Lib Dem, but went and joined the Greens in particular. And yet actually very few of these Reform voters came back. Some did, and some could. It's not that this is like a totalizing thing, but, not enough of them came back. So we've got this like left and right bloc politics, which does kind of make this Progressive Alliance strategy viable to a certain extent. And you are seeing the transfer between those progressive parties. And I think the other thing that makes it viable is that we do just have, at least on the quote unquote progressive side, a singular and shared enemy. Whether you vote and identify with the Lib Dems, Labour or the Greens, you are probably shitting yourself about a Farage premiership. Like, you know what I mean? That is shared in common. And that is just like a very strong motivating factor, I think. In the same way that I think the right were shitting themselves about Corbyn-led government in 2019 after the shock of 2017. And then I think the last thing, which is, a real change in the last couple of decades, is that just party identification has fallen off massively. Like, people used to have a generations long identification with the Labour Party, where their dad was a Labour person and their dad's dad was a Labour person, whatever, rooted in work and the working class base of the party, and the fact that your dad will have worked in industry, and that just does not exist anymore. Like, I think people relate to parties in a far more, at least on the left, relate to parties in a far more promiscuous way, was the way that Steve Akers described it. And they'll pick them up and put them down based on their utility and whether they think it will like bring about the change that they want to see. And for like a Progressive Alliance strategy, which assumes that people will just switch between parties depending on whether it's efficacious or not, that is very useful for it. Obviously, there are lots of good left criticisms of Progressive Alliances. Maybe we'll leave a lot of them to you two, but the big one for me is that it does mean that we end up framing a lot of our politics not in kind of building working class power or rooting in communities or building an eco-socialist party, but in terms of elite alliances with other parties and papering over our differences with those parties, because there are radical differences between a potentially eco-socialist Green Party and the Liberal Democrats led by Ed Davies. They're like fundamentally different political prospects, even if they might be different options for stopping reform. They are fundamentally different prospects. But I think I'll just go back to my original premise, which is like, I think the conditions for quote unquote Progressive Alliance politics are there, but I also think that the necessity for a formal Progressive Alliance, i.e. the Labour leadership and the Green leadership and the Liberal Democrat leadership sitting down and deciding which seats they're going to run in and not run in, I think the necessity of that, I think it might not be necessary. And I think that might be because that the conditions are so ripe for this that people are kind of just working it out for themselves. And they're just working out which party is going to be the best placed, and you don't actually need to go as far as standing down candidates in that formal way. And I think there's the really good thing for the Greens in this regard is that basically every target seat that we have is a Labour 1, Green 2. Like there's no target seat really that the Greens are going for where there's a possibility that you'll campaign really hard as the Greens and then you'll let reform come in through the middle. So for us, like, you know, we can just go and campaign really hard in those seats at the next election. We can tell people you can vote with your heart. We can draw distinctions with Labour because there'll be plenty of stuff that Burnham does that Green voters don't like. Plenty of stuff. And that won't, you know, disrupt the possibility of stopping reform. So yeah, I think it's in this funny contradictory position where like the conditions are so ripe for it that it's almost like you don't need to impose it from a formal elite level.
I just want to trouble one point that you made, and I want to introduce it into the conversation early because I think it's critical. I think we need to trouble the idea of a singular enemy that is represented by reform. I think there are multiple enemies, and actually what we do in one arena can impact what we do in another arena. So for example, what I mean by this is the danger of an electoral progressive alliance is that we don't see the Rottweiler barking at our back door. You know, the pogroms on the streets in Belfast, in Southampton in 2024 show, I think, the strength and confidence of a radical street-based right-wing movement that sees intimidation of its political enemies and violence and ultimately elimination as a viable political strategy for change, right? And the defeat of reform electorally, as necessary as that feels and as necessary as that is, wouldn't be the end of the right and wouldn't be the end of the radical right. And actually, we could see that the defeat of reform electorally actually feeds the radical right and the fascist right, as well as laying the groundwork for a more radical electoral vehicle in Restore. So I think it's really, really critical that we don't see reform as like a singular enemy, and actually we see a multitude of enemies. We see the landscape, the political landscape, as the broader enemy, and keep in mind that we're not just trying to beat reform, we're trying to win a new vision of the world. And that requires a multitude of parallel strategies and therefore a multitude of diverse tactics in order to achieve that vision of winning a better world, right? Because I think if we hyper focus on beating reform, that leads us down a singular electoral path, and it neglects the fact that fascists are trying to kill people on the streets, and actually that voting in Andy Burnham might not necessarily stop that. So yeah, we've got to have that broad vision.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think one of the really useful things that you did there, Joe, was kind of detail the differences between a popular front and a progressive alliance. And I think that's really important in this conversation. I also like, you know, even like the new popular front in France, for example, isn't really a kind of conventional popular front, right? Where you have that kind of class alliance in that same way, right? Should be said. I mean, I wonder if there's something here, right? That being said, about how in a kind of moment where class politics doesn't necessarily take on the same directness and vein as in the past, the progressive alliance is kind of the kind of political expression of that kind of politics. But that's just the thought. That's not the. I want to work that out a little bit more. I guess, you know, I'm a bit of a skeptic here. I'm a bit of a skeptic. There's a big problem I have with the progressive alliance stuff. If you want to win an election under first past the post, you cannot skip the country's post-industrial towns and cities, right? We know that. We've talked about this on the podcast quite a bit. But by having the forces on the left, whether that's the left within Labour, the actual left within Labour, however defanged and weak they are right now, whether that's the Greens, whether that's independents, basically cede a lot of that ground in post-industrial towns and cities to a Burnham-led Labour Party, you might win the election. The left might, the centre-left, the Progressive Alliance might win the election, but you will have done so on the basis of adopting the lowest common denominator anti-migrant politics. You will cede that ground. We will forsake the idea of winning an anti-racist argument, or even beginning an anti-racist argument in places like where I live. So you produce a government which will face huge problems because governments in control of the British state are all undermined by their inability to turn the ship around in one way or another. But you also give room to the politics of the radical right in precisely the places where the far right are making deeper and deeper ground. So that's one problem. For me, to kind of piggyback on Shanice's point, there are multiple enemies. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say one of them is Andy Burnham. I'll be that guy, right? I guess I'll be that guy. The noise seems to be that Burnham's interested in trade and welfare spending for defence. He's talked. Let's see what the final commitment is. But he's talked about keeping Mahmoud as Home Secretary. There's a question about whether he will pursue forms of public ownership. The fact that he's committed to Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules really undermines that possibility. I think Andy Burnham will be the closest thing to a blue Labour Prime Minister this country will ever see, basically. And I think that comes with the caveat that the actual economic policy will not have the heft that someone like a Maurice Glasman would desire. I think there's like a question here about this hero voter thing. I think was really important that you said, Joe. My worry is, though, why would we imagine that Andy Burnham would also not have the same conception of a hero voter, right? I guess one of my worries here is that, in Corbynism, we all did this, right? Like, I definitely did this, but there was a level of projection, I think, from large quarters of the left about what was possible, about a lot of the politics of the people involved, particularly less with Corbyn and McDonald and characters like that, but more with kind of members of the PLP, who were circling around Corbynism. There was a lot of projection about what was possible in that moment. I worry, my big worry with the Burnham situation is there's a lot of that on the left right now. There's a lot of projection onto Burnham. Burnham kind of operates a bit as a floating signifier. There's a lot of projection onto him of what he'll do, what his intentions are. And that worries me. And it worries me in this instance because I do think there's a real scenario where Andy Burnham has the same hero voter as Keir Starmer, effectively. I mean, it should be worth saying that I can't remember now if it was after the Southampton pogroms, if it was after the Belfast pogroms, but Andy Burnham's literal response was to say that he agreed with Nigel Farage on immigration. They were his words to explicitly say that he agreed with Farage. So there's that. And for that, in this context, the Progressive Alliance chat wears thin for me. And I think what you said actually is really important, right? Is that, like, beyond all of that, beyond whether it's possible because of, Burnham has to be Prime Minister for 2.5 years if he gets to be Labour leader and Prime Minister, and he has to deal with the problems of the British state, and there'll be loads of things that will make Greens uncomfortable, as well as other parts of a potential Progressive Alliance. There's also just innumerable questions of tensions and antagonisms that could possibly exist within that coalition. And I guess one of the questions I have in the back of the mind is, even if we take all of the stuff that I've said and all of the stuff that you said and all of the stuff that Shanice has said, our skepticism, and put it to one side, what do those kind of tensions and antagonisms look like when they actually take office? Say in 2029, if a Progressive Alliance is successful and it defeats Reform and Restore in 2029, I'm not sure. That's a question about what kind of alliances actually exist in Parliament and in government, and that poses a huge amount of questions for me too. One thing I've been thinking about a lot is, I think we've talked about the kind of anyone but Labour thing that takes place in some elections on the right. We've talked here today about the anyone but Reform dynamic, right? A kind of deep fear about what a Reform government would look like. And I guess I wonder, with a Burnham-led Labour Party struggling under the weight of Britain's ailing political economy, I guess I wonder if there is the prospect for an anyone but Green dynamic in the situation, right? I wonder if there's a possibility, and I think we saw an unsuccessful flash of this in Gorton and Denton, right? But like a kind of pincer movement, effectively, with a Burnham-led Labour Party. We've seen it with a Starmer-led Labour Party, and Reform, specifically geared towards trying to undermine and delegitimize Zach Belansky's Green Party. And you can see the issues in which that might take place. Those issues that it might coalesce over. Immigration is one of them. Accusations of anti-Semitism might be another one. Crime and drugs policy is one. And I don't think we should dismiss that. The Greens are pretty quiet now. My presumption, I don't know this, is that there's a significant degree of recalibration going on within the Greens at the minute, or at least an attempt to try and work out how do we pivot in this moment? And I think a lot hinges on that in this kind of discussion. But, one of the big things I have, and we've spoken about this before, one of the big issues that I have is that if we take the French example, for example, God, yeah, I know, right? Sunday morning, Burnham will chew into their vote, potentially, and just as the Greens have chewed into Labour's vote. Social democratic parties, as we've seen in France with the relationships between the Socialist Party in France and between the France Insoumise, do not react nicely to parties to the left stealing their votes. he has to be in government for 3 years, almost 3 years. And there are people on the left, such as, is it Karis Roberts from the IPPR, who will be part of his policy-making team. But it's disproportionately loaded with pretty conventional economic figures. People like the former Bank of England's Andy Haldane, Jim O'Neill, a former minister under Cameron's Tories and a Goldman Sachs asset manager, Richard Hughes, formerly of the Office for Budget Responsibility. In our current period, these people and their economic policy inclinations are not electorally popular. And that, I think, will make that antagonism between the Greens, depending on the Greens' pivot, and Labour much more acute, basically. And so that's the kind of thing that I really wanted to ground in, is like, how is this possible in practice, let alone is it desirable?
Well, I think, just to go on that, I think it's possible. It's possible depending on the strategy that Burnham pursues. Like if Burnham fundamentally has a political strategy which is the same as Starmer's, which is to reach out to and try and win back loads of reform voters based on highlighting cultural issues and social issues which divide his own base and alienate his own base and piss off his own base, then yeah, he's going to end up in precisely the same position that Starmer is in, because it will end up being deeply unpopular. He won't attract the reform voters he wants to attract. He'll piss off everyone that already votes Labour or could vote Labour and is in that potential left bloc. And he will create a permission structure which means that Green voters and Zach Polanski won't be able to deal with the Labour Party and won't vote for them, because they'll have just said and done things which are beyond the pale, as Starmer did on the genocide, as Starmer has done on immigration, And if Burnham pursues that political strategy, it'll be no different to Starmer, and the shine will come off very, very quickly. My bet is that he might pursue a different political strategy, not because I think he's our savior, not because I think he's secretly left-wing, but because he's just watched Starmer fail abjectly by pursuing that other political strategy. And there is just, some quite compelling centrist psephology for the fact that doesn't work anymore, from Ansel and Bale and other people. So I can just imagine him trying a different strategy, and I think that it's interesting, like the possibility of vote transfer. Maybe we don't call it Progressive Alliance, because Progressive Alliance, I feel like conventionally does imply coordination between the parties. But to enable vote transfer between, say, like Greens to Labour, Green voters who will be more left-wing and more socially liberal than the average Labour voter, and probably the Labour policy at that point, they have to feel a certain permission to be able to do that and not feel kind of like morally bankrupt for lending them their vote. And that only works if, Burnham is going to have an immigration regime that we won't agree with, for sure. It will be stricter than we would like. But it only works if he does it in a way which, frankly, is more compassionate rhetorically than how Farage and how Starmer talks about immigration. Now, like, I'm not predicting he's going to do one thing or another, but I think it just loads hinges on basically his political strategy, and I think we will just see that very soon. We'll see it through who he appoints to the cabinet. We'll see it through the stuff that he says over the next 6 months to a year. So I think we'll know as to whether it's like got a shot or it's going to just crash and burn really quite quickly. I want to pick up on another point that you said, which I thought was really important, about the sense that the Progressive Alliance the notion or framework of a Progressive Alliance fixes you in a position almost of retreat. And you're a bit like, okay, we're now operating on Progressive Alliance logic. We leave all these post-industrial towns to Labour for Burnham to win with lowest common denominator, anti-migrant politics, and we focus in the cities. I think that is one of the biggest drawbacks and downsides of it. And I think, for me, the best way to think about it is, if we care about stopping reform at election time, whenever it comes, you want to increase the levels of vote coordination and efficiency and stuff between different parties, for sure. But you don't want that to be your master frame for understanding your political project over time.
Yep.
And frankly, like, our job now is to build the Green Party as an eco-socialist party and build as bigger and as broad and as wide coalition for that party as possible. That will mean building in the seats where you can win parliament on a parliamentary level, but it will also mean trying to build an eco-socialist common sense in post-industrial areas, in rural areas, that build entirely new coalitions that we haven't even seen yet. And this The thing with this cephalological, top-down, very electoralist vote block understanding of what's going on is that you guys have made this point better than me on previous podcasts, but it just freezes people in these voter identities as if people don't have incredibly chaotic identities in politics, as if people 100%. Aren't people who like change, and as if new coalitions can't be articulated and can't be brought into being. I still fall back on them because I think they're good, useful, rough heuristics for understanding what's going on in the country at a certain moment, if you treat them gently and you don't take them in this like totalizing way. But we have to remember that we can't let these things just like completely shape our political horizon, because otherwise we just end up thinking in precisely the same terms as people who are more liberal than us and just have a lot more of an institutional politics, and we take on their kind of like institutional electoral politics.
Yeah, I think I really resonate with what Jonas said about the Green Party. I think it could really throw away the historic chapter it's created in its own story, in its politics, in its influence on the British political landscape, in the role that it plays on the left now, by defiling its reputation, by being partly responsible for a Burnham government that ultimately fails, or being associated with its victory via a progressive alliance. And I think the Green Party needs to decide if it will gamble all of the success it's currently garnered and potentially launder it on beating reform in 2029 by almost any means necessary, or will it orientate itself towards its own longer-term vision of the world it wants to build? I think that is a real tension, because we all want to beat reform, but also, does the Green Party exist solely to boost Andy Burnham? Zach Polanski might gamble that Andy Burnham could be the stepping stone to the world the Green Party want to build. But that's a really high stakes gamble, because in any progressive alliance, the Green Party will be a junior partner. They will hold realistically very little political power. They've got 4 MPs. They hold next to no institutional power. They have no connection to the traditional trade unions. They don't represent mass working class in that way. And so I think instead the Greens really need to see themselves as antagonists as opposed to partners, and not antagonists for the sake of antagonism, and not antagonism for the purposes of a pure politics, but antagonism as a source of doing politics, as a source of influence. I think of, for example, the Labour left MPs like Richard Burgon, who have lined up behind Andy Burnham, but it's not clear what they've demanded in return. Like, do you actually even know how to do politics? You don't just line up behind someone and kind of hope for the best and hope you'll get, pray that you'll get some kind of position in a government that hasn't even formed yet. You make demands, you do politics. And the Greens shouldn't make that fatal error of kind of, lining up behind a project in which they have very little power, hoping for a positive outcome. They need leverage. And in order to achieve leverage, you need antagonism. So I think Zach needs to think really carefully about how he can not be seen to kind of needlessly or kind of recklessly tarnish or wreck strategy that can beat reform in 2029. He needs to not be reckless with that. But at the same time, he can't just fall behind it, I don't think, because I think that could be disastrous to the amazing things that they've built.
I think my little phrase would be like differentiation without destruction. And you can look at what Restore's doing at the moment, and I think for the right bloc and the right project, at least electorally, what Restore's doing is just destructive, because they're radicalising their base to the extent that it just doesn't look like they're going to tactically vote for reform. And that, at least on an electoral level, if we think running the state is important and it's a gain for the right or the left to do so, and I do think that, then that just seems destructive. I wouldn't want Zach to like spend the next 3 years saying Andy Burnham is Satan and Andy Burnham's like the worst thing that's ever happened in the world and blah blah blah, because I wouldn't want him to radicalize the Green base to the extent where when it comes to election time, they might not lend their vote to a Labour candidate if the Labour candidate is going to be the best person to beat reform. Like, I do want that to happen, but Zach absolutely needs to understand that he's building a party that is not just a pressure group on the Labour Party. You know what I mean? Like, he is building an independent eco-socialist project, and that means very explicitly differentiating yourself from Labour when Labour do shit things, and Labour will do shit things. It's very, very clear that they're going to do that, especially on social issues, on immigration, on defence policy. And to be fair, I trust Zach to do that. Like, I think rhetorically, so far, the line that Zach has took has been really good. It's been really, really, really good. It's not destructive. It's not like Zara Sultana's line, basically, which is like, remember that Andy Burnham voted for the Iraq War, and it's like, yeah, he did vote for the Iraq War. That is true. Yeah, he did vote for the Iraq War, but also like, it just doesn't seem like the most politically relevant or salient fact right now. It's not really rooted in what's going on right now. It's just like calling back this thing. So yeah, I don't know. I have a decent amount of confidence that the Greens will do that quite well.
I mean, obviously, in lots of ways, I really agree with like you about the Zara Sultana point, right? Often those interventions are not really based on any conception of reality. But that said, like, I mean, I would make it the kind of cutting edge of my intervention, but I do think, and you know, the way that Zara Sultana expresses this point shows the kind of general weakness of her analysis and her intervention in the moment, right? The kind of reliance on that kind of rhetorical flourish. I do think telling and reminding people that Andy Burnham voted for the Iraq War expresses something about Andy Burnham, right?
Of course. I think it's really useful information to understand who Andy Burnham is and has been. I think it is not the basis upon which you should make all of your strategic and tactical decisions now.
Yeah, totally agree. And I would put a little bit of a condition on what you just said, right? I don't necessarily think that Zach Volansky should treat Andy Burnham like Satan, but let's see what Andy Burnham does, right? I think like the attack lines have to be meaningfully contingent on what actually happens. And I think if Andy Burnham is, as I suspect he will be, rubbish on both social policies and political economy, I'm all for going in basically and having kind of deeper attack lines. I guess a question that I have is, and this kind of circles a bit back to the Makerfield stuff, there is a distinctiveness to voter coalitions in different parts of the country. And that's driven by kind of particular events, the nature of those events, and the outcome of those events as the kind of products of a set of processes, right? And we've seen that in a succession of by-elections now, right? What does that mean specifically? It means that in Gorton and Denton, the blocking of Burnham, the strength of Hannah Spencer and the Green campaign, and the possibilities amongst a diverse electorate, as well as a particularly awful candidate in Matt Goodwin, made Green victory possible, right? In Caerphilly, a genuine, and I mean it's a genuinely working class solidaristic impulse, abandoned Labour and got behind Plaid. I'm not saying Plaid are socialist utopians or anything like that, but that impulse got behind them to stop reform, right? And in Makerfield, the most popular politician in the country with a connection to that particular part of the country and a relatively vacuous and kind of emotionally and strategically compelling enough place-based campaign defeated a divided right bloc. I don't say any of this to suggest that there isn't a deep strain of working class anti-racism in this country or that reform are invaluable. We've spent this podcast demonstrating that they're clearly not. But I guess I do want to come back to this point, right? I think these by-election results that we've seen over the course of the past few months aren't generalizable necessarily in national elections, where the scope for the interaction between national political crisis and place-based contingency is just markedly more subordinate to the kind of particularities of multiple campaigns in a 5 or 6 party system. And I guess one of the reasons I think about that is that there is a real remarkable fragility to a lot of the Progressive Alliance talk, right? Because on the one hand, you get an incredible bullishness, like you've talked about, Joe, and you see that online, frankly, a bullishness about reform's defeat, a bullishness about Andy Burnham's victory in Makerfield, that I think does too much to extrapolate from those conditions. But it also comes toe in toe with a kind of terror, right? A legitimate terror. But I think there's a real tension there between a bullishness and a terror amongst these kind of coalitions. I guess I'm still worried. I'm still quite worried about reform, and other people are still quite worried about reform. But I think the kind of bullishness and the way that kind of embeds itself in the Progressive Alliance politics just feels too cocky to me, basically. It feels deeply too cocky for me. That said, I do think there's a question here about where the left thinks it can make gains. And I think the point that you made about can the Greens start to build outwards and kind of build in some competition with Labour. And I think that will become increasingly more important as I suspect Burnhamism will go badly in post-industrial places. And I say this because I think there's a great heterogeneity to these places, right? Makerfield had all of these kind of characteristics that are like replicable in lots of other post-industrial places. Like it's quite old, it's quite white, and it's got lots of car ownership, for example. But it's got lots of stuff that's like quite different, right? Is that there are lots of post-industrial places that are significantly less white than Makerfield, and significantly more diverse and multicultural, even if it's sometimes quite segregated. There are post-industrial places that have kind of similar health inequalities to Makerfield, but have much higher levels of economic inactivity, right? Or of people on the dole, for example. And so I do think there's a kind of coalitional scope for the Greens here to build outwards that we should think quite carefully about, that gets us beyond the kind of block thinking that you kind of rightly derided. And I don't think Burnhamism is going to do that. I really do insist. I think Burnhamism is going to rely on a kind of hero voter idea that you kind of talked about in relation to Starmer, and I think we're seeing that already.
So on the point of are these by-election results going to be generalizable to national election results, insofar as are progressive voters going to be able to organise themselves as well? I think maybe I'm a bit more bullish than you, just in that. Yeah, I understand that there won't be the national attention on every single seat. In the same way, there won't be as many canvassers who, can knock on doors and talk to people and basically provide people with information about the election and about who can win and who can't win in different places. But I do think, coming back to, Jaeger's notion of hyperpolitics, which I find useful, I do think we just live in a hyper-political age where lots of people like talk and think about politics a lot now, and like it's very like present and on their minds. And I think for voters who could be persuaded to vote for one of the left of centre parties, the general election is going to be a real thing for them, because it's going to be the first time where they are actually confronted with the notion that Nigel Farage might become their prime minister. And I do just think there are lots of sections of society that are terrified of that, and I do think that a lot of those people will just be very switched on to the fact that that's happening, and they will be switched on to trying to work out how to stop it. So I don't want to be like overly optimistic about it, but there are countervailing factors that don't happen in an by-election, such as Farage becoming prime minister, which I think is really important. And then just to your point on not all in post-industrial areas are the same. There are areas in which the left can make gains. They're also just like the left has to try and make gains in these areas. We can't just abandon half the country. I don't think, almost from not just from strategic reasons, but almost from kind of like moral reasons. But yeah, I was just thinking about the constituency that I grew up in and that I'm in now, actually, because I'm up visiting my parents, Penistone and Stocksbridge, and it is in some ways quite similar to Makerfield, but there are just key differences in that like part of the constituency is just definitely a bit more wealthy. There's plenty of social liberalism around. Like there is a Greek bakery, and there's a Greek
Love
bakery.
A Greek bakery.
There's like a tap house which does ale. Like all the guys in there have got like long beards and stuff when they're into their ales, and I don't know, man. Like it's just I think in the council elections we elected Labour, Lib Dem, and Reform, and maybe a Tory councillor across the like different wards in this constituency. You know what I mean? It was a complete mix. But you could totally see the Lib Dem councillors being Green councillors for other reasons, or you could totally see there being local representation from some either like regional left party, if that were set up, or a worker focused party set up by the independent unions or whatever. Completely possible. Like the idea that the left can't win in Penistone and Stocksbridge is mad. And I think that just speaks to your point that like politics is always being made and remade, and coalitions are always being built and rearticulated. And I think that we need to understand politics as it is, but when you're understanding politics as it is just a snapshot that has already become old and already become out of date. And we're in the business of forging these new identities and building these new coalitions as political actors. We're not just observers of like a political reality that's happening to us and is fixed and immutable and can't change. And I think that we have to give ourselves agency in that way, and we have to really remember that.
I 100% agree with that. Yeah, and I feel quite close to that point of view emotionally and morally, as well as politically and strategically. The one thing I'd say to your previous point before that is that I really don't want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister. I think that would be a really bad thing. And I totally resonate with people's fears about that. And I think you're right. I think those fears are huge, and I think they're quite pervasive and predominant amongst large parts of society, particularly after the last fortnight of riots, actually. I think as well, maybe that has to be one of the lines that Zach Belansky adopts over the next coming weeks and months of Burnhamism, if you like, is that he wants to stop reform. And if Burnham is to carry on in the kind of triangulatory trajectory that we've seen over the course of the by-election, it is Andy Burnham, not Zach Belansky and the Greens, that is preventing the possibility of stopping reform by conceding to their anti-migrant logic, by not making an improvement in people's lives, by not trying to turn the ship around. And I think that has to be one of the key attack lines that Zach Belansky adopts.
Well, Zach, if you're listening, Jonas charges £100 an hour, so there's his, there's his comes advice.
All right, so great conversation, lads. Always a pleasure to chat to you. And I think ultimately this conversation shows that there are going to be many, many more debates on these questions to come. So yeah, I look forward to hearing everyone who's listening and what your thoughts are as well. So finally, the readings for this week. Jonas, what have you been reading?
I feel like I've said this probably every episode for like the last 2 or 3 episodes, but like, man, I just read an amazing, astoundingly good book, The Secret History by Todd. Just like quite funny, remarkable character portraits. And it's just like really smartly and then quite ambiguously narrated, I guess, crime thriller, but quite unconventional crime thriller about a group of classicist students at a kind of not quite elite university in the US who get involved in some nasty stuff, basically, some kind of cultish killings, and it kind of radically changes their lives and their fortunes. The character's relationship, in particular the narrator, the character who is a narrator, their relationship to alcohol, the relationship to sleep, like it's all kind of thrown in the mix. So you have this wonderful story, brilliantly portrayed by this narrator, but you're never quite sure how reliable the story is, basically. And it's done so brilliantly. I really just recommend everyone read it.
And Joe, how about you?
Yeah, so this week I've been reading loads actually, but I think the thing that I would want to highlight is a book that I've just started. So I'm not gonna say that I agree with all its conclusions because I haven't read them yet. But it's called All In: A Revolutionary Theory to Stop Climate Collapse, and it's a kind of anti-capitalist manifesto written by Sinan Eden and Mariana Rodrigues. They're 2 Portuguese climate activists from a group called Climaximo, who are really fantastic, and you should check them out. And I think that the reason that I'm really enjoying it, there's 2 reasons. Number one is it's a popular but like directly written strategic text where it is trying to take in a lot of theory and a lot of history, but articulate in a way which is super readable and kind of like take on this fundamental strategic issue of our time, which is the fact that we have this looming horizon of climate collapse, and we just don't really seem to have a broad strategy for solving that. And the implied thing is that if we don't have a broad strategy for solving that, then we are just succumbing to barbarism in a deep way. And I think this is just the elephant in nearly every room when we talk about politics at the moment, and it's just very rarely addressed because I think we're fearful and we want to look away. And these guys don't look away; they look very directly at it. And they have like the revolutionary left on one hand, who they say have all of the kind of correct anti-capitalism, but very little ability to put it into practice, and they end up in kind of reading groups and small rooms talking to each other. And then you have the kind of pragmatic reformers of, say, Green New Dealism, who they very much get stuff done in the world, and they influence governments and all of that, but they end up in this like degree by degree logic, which is inherently reformist, of like, well, if we can just get 0.1 degrees lower or 0.5 degrees lower, then that's a good thing. And there's like a strong urgency of, well, whatever we can do to lower the heating because like it's going to be really, really bad. And then they lose the kind of anti-capitalist revolutionary horizon. And the purpose of the book is to try and chart a way between those 2 poles. And that just really resonated with me when I read that in the chapter, because precisely what we need to do, and I suppose in my own small ways what I've been trying to do. And again, I'm not at the end of the book, so maybe the conclusions are crap, who knows. But it's the first bit of non-fiction political writing for a while that's just really stuck with me, and I felt really drawn to. So even though I haven't finished it, I wanted to highlight it.
So my reading this week is, I've been reading Lucy Cook. She's a zoologist, and she wrote this book called Bitch, A Revolutionary Approach to Sex in the Female Species. And it's just incredible. It's not political, but it is attempting to make a feminist intervention in zoology and the kind of historic lack of attention that's been given to the female sex. And it is just mind-blowing how diverse the sexes show up in nature. Like, to give you a couple of examples, female hyenas have 8-inch clitorises that are actually bigger than, I know, right? And they're bigger than male hyena penises. And yeah, it is insane. And there's a mole species that is like dynamically intersex. So at one point in the year, its hormones will make its ovaries bigger so that it can reproduce. And at another point in the year, when the breeding season's over, its hormones will make its ovaries more into testes, which then allows it to produce more testosterone so that it can protect its new babies and protect its environment. And this is just within female moles. And I think just what's fascinating about it is it shows just how politicized and political our notion of sex is, and how, despite the vast diversity that exists in the natural world and even in the human species, how binary we see sex, not just gender, but also sex, and just how antithetical to reality that binary actually is. So that's everything for this week. Thanks for listening, everyone. And don't forget to sign up and register for our live show, Friday, the 3rd of July, Pelican House in London. We're 50% sold out already. We've got Joshua Virasamy joining us. So if you don't want to miss Josh, get your ticket now. We're going to be announcing 2 more guests in the week. So yeah, can't wait to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.